In the year 430 BC, the most advanced civilization on Earth made a fatal miscalculation. The leaders of Athens believed they could protect their people by building walls, massive fortifications that would keep out any invading army. What they could not anticipate was that the greatest threat would not come from the gates. It would arrive silently, hidden in the cargo holds of merchant ships. Within weeks, those walls designed to protect would become the walls of a prison, and then the walls of a mass grave. This is the story of the Plague of Athens, a catastrophe that killed tens of thousands, shattered the foundations of democracy, and forced humanity to confront a terrifying truth about civilization itself. Athens, in the 5th century BC, stood at the pinnacle of human achievement. This was the city that gave the world democracy.
Men of Athens, consider the evidence presented. The water clock runs low, but the truth remains clear.
Philosophy, and some of the greatest art ever created. The Parthenon had been completed just a few years earlier. Socrates walked these streets. Playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides were producing works that would be studied for millennia. But Athens had enemies. Chief among them was Sparta, the militaristic city-state to the south. War between Athens and Sparta had been building for decades, and by 431 BC, open conflict had begun. This was the start of what historians call the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that would last nearly 3 decades. The Athenian leader Pericles faced a strategic dilemma. Sparta had the superior land army. In open battle, the Spartans would almost certainly win. Pericles understood this, so he developed what he believed was an unbeatable strategy. Athens controlled the seas. The Athenian navy was the most powerful in the Mediterranean. As long as Athens could receive supplies by ship, it could survive any siege. So Pericles ordered the construction of the Long Walls. These massive fortifications connected Athens to its port at Piraeus, creating a protected corridor several miles long. The entire population of the surrounding Attic countryside was instructed to move inside the walls. Farms, villages, and estates were abandoned as hundreds of thousands of people relocated to the urban center. In Pericles' mind, this was genius. The Spartans could burn the crops and ravage the countryside, but Athens itself would remain safe. Its people would be fed by grain ships from Egypt and the Black Sea. The Spartans would eventually grow tired and go home. What Pericles did not calculate was the consequence of cramming 5 times the intended population into a city designed for far fewer people. The streets became choked with refugees. Temple gardens that once served as peaceful retreats were now filled with makeshift shelters. Abandoned towers became overcrowded dormitories. Sanitation systems designed for a smaller population could not handle the waste. Clean water became scarce. Privacy vanished entirely. Families slept in conditions that would be considered dangerous even by ancient standards. Pericles had promised his people safety. Instead, he had inadvertently created the perfect incubation chamber for epidemic disease. The port of Piraeus was one of the busiest harbors in the ancient world. In the summer of 430 BC, a merchant vessel docked at Piraeus. Perhaps it had sailed from North Africa, perhaps from the eastern Mediterranean. The exact origin remains unknown, but hidden among the cargo, in the form of infected sailors or perhaps disease-carrying animals, was something far more deadly than any Spartan army. A few men developed fevers. Some complained of headaches. These initial cases might have seemed unremarkable. Illness was common in crowded ports, but within days, it became clear that this was something different. The historian Thucydides was living in Athens during this period. He would later contract the disease himself and survive. His account of the plague remains one of the most important medical documents from antiquity. His hand, he tells us, trembled as he recorded what he witnessed. The disease attacked the head first. Victims experienced sudden, violent fevers. Their eyes became red and inflamed. The throat and tongue began to bleed internally, and the breath of the sick carried a distinctive, fetid odor that those who survived never forgot. As the disease progressed, it moved to the chest. Patients developed severe coughs and chest pain. Vomiting of bile followed, along with painful stomach cramps. The skin developed a reddish discoloration, but perhaps the most distinctive symptom was an unbearable internal heat. Victims described feeling as though they were burning from within. This thirst became so overwhelming that some threw themselves into public cisterns and water tanks, desperate for relief. Thucydides noted that most patients died between the 7th and 9th day of illness. Those who survived this critical period often saw the disease descend into their bowels, causing uncontrollable diarrhea and ultimately death from exhaustion. One of the cruelest ironies of the plague was that the people best equipped to help were among the first to die. Physicians in ancient Athens practiced a form of medicine based largely on observation and physical contact with patients. They examined the sick, felt their foreheads, looked into their mouths, and administered treatments by hand. This close contact made them extraordinarily vulnerable. While the average Athenian might avoid the sick out of fear, physicians had a professional obligation to attend to the suffering. They entered homes where multiple family members lay dying. They leaned close to examine rashes and lesions. They touched the infected and breathed the same air. The result was predictable. Physicians died in disproportionate numbers. It was a psychological blow to Athenian confidence. It shook the faith of the people in the power of knowledge itself. Some turned to prayer. Temples that had once been centers of civic religion now filled with the desperate and dying. The marble floors of the Parthenon, sacred ground normally forbidden to common people, became covered with bodies. Priests who administered holy rites became conduits of infection. People died clinging to the knees of statues of Zeus. They perished at the base of Apollo's image while pleading for divine intervention. Thucydides made a cold observation that would resonate through the centuries. Those who prayed died at the same rate as those who cursed the gods. The disease made no distinction between the pious and the profane. For many Athenians, this seemed proof that the gods had either sided with Sparta or abandoned the city entirely. As the plague continued month after month, something began to break within Athenian society. Thucydides gave this phenomenon a name. He called it anomia. The word translates roughly as lawlessness, but its meaning runs deeper. It describes a state in which all social norms, all expectations of behavior, and all sense of moral order simply evaporate. The logic was simple, if devastating. If you are going to die tomorrow, why follow the rules today? Why pay your debts? Why respect property rights? Why fear punishment for crimes when the judges themselves are dying? The courts closed. There was no one left to conduct trials. And even if there had been, the threat of legal consequence seemed meaningless to people who expected death within days. The wealthy barricaded themselves in their homes, but this offered little protection. Servants contracted the disease and brought it inside. Family members fell ill and infected everyone else. Grand homes and estates were looted while their owners lay dying on the threshold. Slaves who had spent their lives in servitude suddenly found themselves with no masters to obey. Some drank wine from the finest cups and slept in their masters' beds. The hierarchy that had structured Greek society for generations collapsed within weeks. The streets of Athens presented a scene of surreal contrast. On one side, the gasping and moaning of the dying. On the other, the sounds of wild laughter and revelry from those who had decided that if death was coming, they would meet it drunk and entertained. People spent their savings on immediate pleasures. They engaged in behavior they would never have considered in normal times. The reasoning was consistent and terrifying in its implications. There was no tomorrow, so nothing mattered. This was not mere hedonism. It was existential despair expressed through action. When the divine framework collapses and legal authority vanishes, humans are confronted with a disturbing question. What, if anything, restrains our darkest impulses? For some Athenians, the answer was nothing at all. And yet, not everyone died. Thucydides himself contracted the disease and survived. In his account, he makes an observation that would prove foundational to the development of medical science. Those who recovered from the plague did not fall ill again. The concept of acquired immunity did not yet have a name. The word antibody would not be coined for more than 2,000 years. But Thucydides had identified something real and something important. Survivors had gained a protection that could not be taken away. These survivors became a distinct group within Athenian society. They could enter homes filled with the sick and walk out unharmed. They could touch the dead without fear of contagion. In a city paralyzed by terror, they alone could move freely. Some of these survivors took on the grim work that no one else could perform. They collected bodies from homes where entire families had perished. They transported corpses to mass burial sites. They managed the chaos as best they could. Whether this should be called heroism is a matter of interpretation. For men who had lost their families, their friends, and their hopes, perhaps it was simply the only thing left to do. The dead had to be disposed of, but even this became a source of conflict. Fuel for funeral pyres was scarce. Wood had to be gathered, transported, and arranged before a body could be cremated according to proper custom. A man would collect enough wood for his own deceased family member, but the moment he turned his back, a stranger might rush in and throw their own corpse onto the flames. Every sacred tradition surrounding death and burial was violated. The rituals that had given meaning to mortality for generations were abandoned out of necessity and desperation. Outside the walls of Athens, the Spartans observed and waited. Their original plan had been to besiege the city and force its surrender. But as the weeks passed, they noticed something disturbing. Black smoke rose constantly from within the walls. The smell of burning flesh drifted across the countryside. Refugees who managed to escape told stories of horror beyond imagination. The Spartans were among the finest soldiers in the ancient world. They feared no army, but they feared the plague. When they understood what was happening inside Athens, they made a decision that seemed to contradict everything about their warrior culture. They retreated. The plague had become a weapon more terrible than any Athenian army could have fielded. It protected the city from invasion, but at a cost that no strategist could have intended or desired. By the time the worst of the plague had passed, Athens had lost approximately 1/3 of its population. Some estimates suggest the death toll reached 100,000 people. Among the dead was Pericles himself, the leader whose strategy had brought everyone inside the walls. He died in 429 BC, a victim of the same catastrophe he had inadvertently enabled. The plague eventually burned itself out. When there were no more susceptible hosts to infect, when the survivors had developed immunity and the vulnerable had died, the disease retreated as silently as it had arrived. The Athens that emerged from this catastrophe was not the same city that had entered it. The confidence and optimism of the Periclean age was gone. Democratic institutions had been weakened. Faith in the gods had been shaken. The social fabric that had held the city together showed permanent tears. And yet, something valuable emerged from the disaster. Thucydides wrote his account with a specific purpose. He believed that plagues would come again, and that future generations should be prepared. His careful documentation of symptoms, progression, and social effects became a model for medical and historical writing. More than that, his observation about acquired immunity planted a seed that would eventually grow into the field of immunology. It would take more than 2 millennia before scientists understood the mechanisms involved. But the basic insight was there in Thucydides' text. The year was 430 BC when the plague arrived. By the time it departed, Athens had learned a lesson that every generation must relearn for itself. Walls cannot protect against every threat. Crowding creates vulnerability. When fear becomes overwhelming, social order can disintegrate with shocking speed. But the plague also revealed something else. Even in the darkest moments, some people kept records. Some people helped the dying. Some people thought about the future. The survival of Thucydides' account is proof that human knowledge can outlast catastrophe. The virus eventually became saturated. It ran out of victims to claim. Athens fell in the end, not immediately, but decades later, weakened by losses it never fully recovered from. But the knowledge it left behind proved more durable than its marble temples. A virus can destroy a city. It can kill a leader. It can shatter faith and collapse order. But it cannot destroy the human capacity to observe, to record, and to learn. That, perhaps, is the only true immunity.